Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will be starting a recording of this session very shortly. Thank you very much. Well, everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to our very first Nimdzi webinar called Analysis of Top LSPs in the World by Revenue. This webinar is the first of a series of 3 free webinars that we will be running in the coming weeks. We are streaming this webinar live from Facebook and YouTube. A recording of this session will be available only for Nimdzi members. Your hosts today are Renato Beninatto, our CEO and co-founder, Konstantin Dranch, our chief researcher. They will be walking us through our latest Nimdzi 100 report. My name is Sandra Oliveira, and I'm the business development director here at Nimdzi. Mr. Tucker Johnson, our managing director and co-founder, who is behind the scenes making sure this webinar runs smoothly. We're going to allow perhaps a couple of minutes before going ahead and starting with our housekeeping items. I'm going to allow 2 more minutes, and then we can continue with our housekeeping items. We're just going to be waiting for a few more people to join in. Okay? Thank you very much. We're just allowing a few more people to join in. Well, guys, with 3 minutes in, I think it's okay to say that we are going to start going. So once again, guys, welcome to our very first Nimdzi webinar called Analysis of Top LSPs in the Worldwide Revenue. The webinar is the first of a series of 3 free webinars that we'll be running over the next coming weeks. Okay, we're streaming this webinar live from Facebook and YouTube, and a recording of this webinar will be available to our Nimdzi members. As I said before, your hosts today are Renato Beninatto, our CEO and co-founder. Him and Konstantin Dranch, who is our chief of researcher, will be walking us through our latest Nimdzi 100 report. As I said before, my name is Sandra Oliveira, and I'm the Business Development Director. Mr. Tucker Johnson, who is our Managing Director and co-founder, is behind the scenes making sure this webinar runs smoothly. Now, a couple of few housekeeping items. Feel free to post any questions at any time during the presentation in the comments or the chat windows in either platform. Tucker will be taking your questions and will answer them at the end of the presentations. If your question is not answered today, we will be coming back to you within a couple of days. Follow us on social media. We're in LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, whatever is your preferred. So just follow us on social media. And the hashtag for the webinar is hashtag Nimdzi100. The Twitter handles are also available in the slides for your convenience. By registering to the webinar, you are already eligible to receive our regular updates via email when we publish our new content. So I think that's everything for me, guys. Without further ado, Renato, they're all yours. Renato, I think you're muted.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I
No
wasn't
problem.
unmuted before, so I'll start again. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be talking to you from all over the world, participating in these 3 platforms. And what I'd like to introduce essentially is why we started this study and why did we start a ranking of translation companies. There were essentially 2 reasons why behind our initiative. The first one was that information about the market is important when it's released early. And with the speed of information and access to information that we have today, we believe that by early March, when we released this survey, the first version of the research was a good time to issue this. The difference between our ranking and other rankings that are available in the market is that we based the ranking on research instead of basing it on surveys or information directly from the providers. What this means is that we have unveiled some companies that were not previously known, and that we can reach a wider audience by identifying information that is probably not 100% accurate, but is correct. And why is it important? It's important for LSPs to know who they're competing against, not necessarily only for clients, because some of these new players that we identified do not cater to the traditional customers, but because they're competing for talent, they're competing for technology, and they're also innovating in this space. It's also important for investors because they want to know what are the trends and what is the growth that we have in this space, one of the fastest growing industries in the world. And we provide them with a shopping list for their next investments. But I'd like Kostya to start talking a little bit more about our research.
All right. Thank you, Renato, and hello, everyone. Let me walk you through the methodology. Basically, our objective was to quickly identify the big players in the major economies. Both Renato and I have extensive networks of industry peers, so we reached to experts in local markets and asked them, okay, who are the biggest companies in your region who have more than $10 million in revenue? And these kind of companies are difficult to hide because they hire people, they have big offices, they have big presence. So we identified quite a few of them, potentially around 180 companies. Once we had the list of these potential companies with $10 million or more in revenue, we approached them directly and asked the management for the up-to-date revenue information. If they didn't provide, we went to the business registers or even created our own estimates using competitive analysis, number of employees, publications on media. So basically, the list is more towards the comprehensive side. We considered an LSP a company that has more than half of its revenue coming from language services, and we have a wide definition of language services, which includes, for example, multilingual copywriting, if you need to create content in a few languages. Then we calculated growth using companies' reporting currency. So for a French company that would be euros, Russian company that would be rubles, for Chinese company that would be RMB, but presented all the companies in one list using US dollars as a common denominator, and we used an average annual currency conversion rate. So that's an average for every day of trading. So if you compare our ranking with other rankings, there might be some discrepancies because of a different exchange rate. The rule of the thumb is to consider these figures measure of their size. You want to know where the company is in the ballpark. Actual figures might be a little bit different. As the annual accounts come out, we still correct the list, and it's a live one. It's on the internet, so we can quickly update it. Some companies publish their annual accounts maybe a year after the reporting year. So it will be still updated. But the important thing is, you know who the big companies are. They're in the open. You know their approximate revenue. You know who the leaders are. This includes those companies that never participated in these rankings before. Let me show you quickly how it looks like in practice. So you can go to Nimdzi website, and the revised version is an interactive table. So you can quickly type something to search through the table. Let's say you want to see who are the big interpreting companies. So you just type interpreting, and the list will sort itself. Or you'd like to see who the big companies in France are. So you can just type France, and there you go. You have the biggest players in France. So it's pretty convenient. And if you want, you can even download the CSV file behind that and use it for market information purposes or your own analysis if you'd like to run the figures through your own analytics system. Okay, let me go get back to the presentation. Right. Okay, so we have the revenues. The revenues are an important measure of size, but of course, they are not the most important. The most important is profit. But unfortunately, most companies do not publish their profits. This is not a piece of information which is easily available, and this is not something you can find on the internet. I'm just giving you an example here of 5 companies that have different levels of profits and how these levels of profits and also their business model affects evaluation. At the top, you can see on the y-axis, you can see the multiplier to the revenue, and the number means market capitalization. How many times the company is valued against its revenue. And on the x-axis is the revenue. So TransPerfect and Lionbridge are the biggest companies by revenue, so they're on the right. But Keywords and RWS Group, who are traded on the stock exchange, are highest by market capitalization. Keywords and RWS, the valuations are based on the price of the stock. But Language Line Solutions was actually a deal in 2016 when they sold the company for $1.5 billion. And that was approximately 4 times the revenue at the time and 10 times the EBIT, the profit before taxes and amortization. So what's really important here is to understand that size is everything, business model, and what the company is doing and its profitability. This is really what is important. And we're going to talk a little bit about this now, about the business models. Renato?
Thank you, Kostya. Well, in our research, we have identified 6 types of companies that have reached the $6 million club. The $100 million club. So there are 6 types of companies that in this industry that have reached more than $100 million in revenue. The first group is what we call the generalist translation company. They have multiple offices, they have a strong sales presence, they have a huge supply chain. Some of them have their own technology, and they offer clients scale and guarantees of stability and business continuity. If you purchase from one of these leading companies that are all familiar brands, and there is a mistake in the translation, no one's going to punish you for your choice of vendor. It's the old, you never get fired for buying from IBM. This should be the safe bets. The next type, the second type, is what we call the build and buy new leaders. These are companies like RWS and Keywords who entered the top 20 after a series of acquisitions. If you go back a couple of years ago, these companies were flying under the radar, and very quickly they exceeded $100 million in revenue. Every time they buy a company, their market valuation goes up. They can issue shares at this higher valuation and buy new companies. So this has driven up the multipliers in our space. RWS recently bought Luz and Moravia for 10 times or 11 times EBITDA, which is much more than the usual 5 to 7 times that had been the case before. By doing that, their market valuation doubled. So it's a profitable deal. You invest a little and your valuation goes up significantly, as you can see in the graph for RWS, for keywords in the black line and RWS in the orange line. There are other companies like ULG in the United States, Semantics in Sweden, and Technicis in France that have access to private equity and follow the same model. But we believe that there's going to be more players following this model. Next, we have identified this group that has usually been missing from the rankings. That is the public sector and defense contractor. They also represent a big market. Some people evaluate this segment of the market at $1 billion, and this is a pessimistic view. Others, the conspiracy theorists, will tell you that the market is much, much bigger because they believe that there is a lot of secret, invisible stuff that is going on in the space. So companies like Mission Essential Personnel that you have listed here and Global Linguist Solutions, they staff linguists for the military. They need to find and vet bilingual people with and one of the hardest things is this obtaining security clearance for them to be able to work in sensitive materials. And in recent years, they have been ramping up their multilingual intelligence analysis capability, which involves some artificial intelligence, machine learning, neuro-machine translation. And why are they part of their market? For the same reason that I mentioned at the opening. They hire linguists, they buy and develop technology, they create processes, and they are part of our community, even though they're not necessarily negotiating contracts at the same tables that you are. Kostya.
Yes, thanks, Renato. So going on to my favorite business model, these are media localization studios or even networks of studios. These guys dub or provide subtitles for films, for TV programs, for TV series. And in the last couple of years, they've seen a huge boom in the business, driven by OTT streaming platforms like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and what's the other one? HBO, Renato, right? HBO. Especially though Netflix. All of the fastest growing companies on our list for growth are media localization studios, and we'll show it a little bit on. This is a very specialized market, and to work here, they need to have this access to the pool of voice talent. They need to cast artists. They need to have studios all around the world to provide the native speakers with correct equipment. They need to do lip syncing, version control. So there's a lot of competency and know-how that goes with this model. But at the moment, this is the fastest growing space in the market, and we're proud to show that we have a good list of this media localization studio networks. You see it here. Deluxe Media could be the biggest. We couldn't get a very good estimate of the revenue. Some say it's about 150 million. Some say it's about $250 million. And it's difficult to estimate because they not only have localization services, but also post-production services that have to do with processing those movies or visual effects. Anyway, the growth of these companies and the size of these companies is quite impressive. Moving on to the next type of company in the $100 million club, interpreting companies. And these are primarily remote interpreting, such as Language Line, which is a telephone interpreting, and Cyrocom, contact centers. And contrary to the usual interpreting companies, these guys do not just sell per minute interpreting. What they provide is a guarantee. So they would have a call center, and they would guarantee that at a given time, at a given place, there's going to be a linguist in a required language. Even at night or on weekend, there's someone in the booth, manning the booth. These companies have grown primarily in the markets where there is a requirement, a legal requirement to have interpreting for hospitals, for the police, for government services. So these guys provide this public sector and big institutions with the required guarantees. And that's why they got big compared to small interpreting companies, because interpreting is a market which is smaller than translations. And here we have another type of a company in a $100 million club, which is a multilingual marketing provider. In the recent few years, advertising huge groups such as Publicis, WPP, and Omnicom, they have acquired or built their own multilingual language services departments. Why is it important? Let's say you're producing an advertising for a huge brand that has to go into many markets. And here I have as an example, Nescafe ad. You want to launch it as quick as possible at a low cost. So when you have a language services company at the table very early on, they can adapt the script, they can catch the internalization, globalization issues very early on. Like on these screenshots, you have those posters, ex-girlfriends, university. In the original script, without a language service company, this could have been something way in the wind, something really difficult to redraw and requiring lots of efforts to localize after the edit has been produced. But with the language service company on board, and the language services are, of course, not as profitable as advertising. With the language services company on board, the advertising group can make a much more compelling case at the table. So Hogarth worldwide is rumored to be around $250 million in revenue. Prodigious and Translate Plus together, including multilingual copywriting, could have up to $226 million in revenue. So these are significant companies. And this model is appealing to more and more players, but it's not very easy to build a successful fusion of this market and localization. Renato?
Thank you, Kostya. The only type of company missing in this analysis is what people call the Uber of translation services. They haven't reached the scale that they need. We have found some players that work in this transactional long tail market, but they haven't been able to break the 100 million mark. The smartest people in the industry built this platform, LSPs, where customers can just buy online and have a self-service interface, and with very little human involvement. The technology is amazing, it's valuable, but in terms of revenue, they haven't broken the $100 million mark. And as you can see here, we have 3 of them in our ranking, and we have listed a couple more that are not part of the ranking. They're below the revenue threshold, but they're still players in this space. Back to you, Kostya.
Yeah, now we're going to speak a little bit about geography, and I'll just quickly skip to the slide. We've placed those companies that have $10 million or more in revenue on a map to see where they come from, which countries have the largest LSPs. And the interesting conclusion is that the single country with the biggest number of large LSPs, medium and large, is the United States. And there's approximately the same number of large companies in the whole Eurozone, but with a small caveat that the Eurozone includes United Kingdom, which is living on the way out. So both of them together, they dwarf the Asian countries by the number of large LSPs. Here, if you look at the number of LSPs, you'll see still that United States has, let's say, 20% of the world's LSPs. But in terms of the number of biggest LSPs, it's 40%, 45%. So it's a very good market to start doing business in. There could be entrepreneurial, smart people, very good at sales in any country. But where you start, where your home market is, plays a huge role. You need to have the fertile ground where your company can grow. And the most fertile ground, of course, is the United States. Moving on, a small puzzle here. So just to put into perspective, India and Brazil, their exports and their GDP is much higher than those of Sweden. But in India and Brazil together, there could be just maybe one, maybe two max LSPs that have $10 million or more in revenue. And even those LSPs, they say that they're American, not Indian. At the same time, in Sweden, there are 8 large companies. Although the size of the economy is smaller. What is the reason behind that ratio? So one is the cost of services. In United States, an average price per word could be about 20 cents. In Europe, it's about 15, 18 dollar cents to the final buyer if it's a Western European company that's selling. So by doing the same number of pages, a translator or a translation company in the West produces much more turnover than their counterpart in India, let's say, where the price could go as low as 2 cents per word. The other reason is the access to large buyers. There are many brands that come to your mind when you think of Sweden, IKEA, Volvo, Scania, and they fuel the translation industry with their international expansion. Renato?
Thank you, Kostya. But as they say, every rule has an exception, and in this case, we're going to talk about 2 companies that don't follow this rule. They are companies, Moravia, based in the Czech Republic, in the second city of the Czech Republic, and Appen, based in Australia. These are companies that they have grown over $100 million, even though their home market is not a big, strong market. The reason why they do this is that because these companies have focused selling to large customers like Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft in the West Coast of the United States. And that's the thing that they have in common. So if we take a look at this first part of our webinar, the conclusions that we can reach is that there are many more companies in the world that are large than we expected originally. We had to dig and find some of these players that are well known in the local markets, but not to the international community. We have identified multiple ways, and this is a characteristic of the translation and localization industry, that language services span so many markets and so many different services that are multiple paths for reaching the top, to reach over $100 million in revenue. The US market continues to be the single biggest market in terms of opportunity. And we've also seen that companies that focus on the enterprise market tend to have, or government, tend to have higher revenues than those that are focusing on the retail market. Kostya. Oh, no, it's me.
It's you, Renato. Go ahead.
So, talking again, which are the companies that are booming? Let's talk a little bit about growth rate. We have looked, as you know, Nimdzi has been around for not so long, but we plan to be around for a long, long time. So we've looked at the trends in the market for the past 2 years, what has happened in the last 2 years. And one of the things and we use that, we call this the Slingshot Approach. We look back like in a slingshot, and we try to look at the future and plan how things are going, and project how things are going to be. So our projection is that the market for the next 5 years is going to grow at an average compound aggregate growth rate, or CAGR, of 7.4%, and we should be reaching something like $60 billion in 2020. We are quite optimistic about this because if we look at the leading companies, they're growing at an average rate of 12%. And some of those companies are growing at a much, much higher rate. Kostya, why don't you tell us about the individual companies since you did this analysis?
Yeah, gladly. So in this presentation, we'll just cover a couple of trends that we've noticed. One of them is that mergers and acquisitions really drive the growth. So both Keyword Studios and RWS, the build and buy new leaders, have tripled or went 3.5 times in size over the last 2 years by acquisitions. There is some organic growth there as well, but the primary source of their increasing in size these are the acquisitions, of course. Now the companies as well. In France, in particular, this last year, the market has been completely transformed by the acquisitions made by Technisys, by DataWords, and by HO Trad. And other companies are also looking for targets. So when you're a small company, you sell at 3 times the revenue. Medium, not revenue, EBITDA. Medium, 5 to 7 times. Large and a good sector such as life sciences, 10 times the EBITDA. So it makes sense to grow, and it also makes sense to grow by acquisitions because then you can resell at a better multiplier to EBITDA and maybe buy yourself a castle in France or an island in the Caribbean. It's a very powerful trend, and I think it's going to continue because of this rationale. This means that medium-sized companies that are profitable, that are interesting, are going to see more offers from buyers. It's a good time to negotiate and maybe sell or maybe buy other companies. And one more conclusion I see here, there could be some danger to LSPs that are selling to other LSPs because the vendor management function, this build and buy companies, they're going to be centralized at some point. So they might just lose their client because the system has changed. Okay, now we go to organic growth. As you can see here, the top 4 companies with the fastest 2-year organic growth are all in media localization, especially Ayuno and Zoo Digital Group. They've been $10-11 million companies 2 years ago. They became Netflix preferred vendors. They've seen this growth during Netflix's expansion, this international program that they've rolled out with lots of scripted programs. I think they went from 0 to 600 hours of scripted television in 2 years, and this volume has to be localized. And of course, if you're a small company and you get $10 million, $20 million in work, that makes your revenue explode and go over the top. The SDI Media, which is a 220 million company, they grew, for example, by 10% of the last year. Not as fast because they're already big. It's the low base which drives these crazy numbers, and I think tripling in size organically is crazy. The other companies that are growing at a fast rate, they all have individual reasons. What we could trace for now is that these companies are developing their sales function and a unique proposition in the market, but primarily they've invested in having a good sales service. We'll look deeper into that, and we can talk to you about this. Okay, Renato, final conclusions here.
Yes, so we've gone through all this brief analysis, and you can reach some of these conclusions yourselves, but we're very optimistic about the language services market. It remains a growth market. I like to say that language services is an industry that is impervious to crisis. It's always growing. There's always new opportunities. There's always new segments, new markets that require translation. So if you're an investor, this is a market to stay. It's a market to invest. It's a market to grow. The other conclusion is that this new reality. We have had in the industry many cycles of mergers and acquisitions. For those of you who have been around, you can remember when there were companies like Berlitz, Baum, that were merged, and then they were acquired by Lionbridge. And both Berlitz and Baum had been the result of several mergers and acquisitions over the years. But what is happening now is that it's happening at a different clip and at a much larger revenue levels. The build and buy companies are moving much faster than everybody else. M&A continues. We hear every day about M&A activities happening. But the phenomenon to watch for is the big companies try to buy the medium-sized companies, and there is a vacuum that is created. Right now, large companies are targeting companies in the $20 to $50 million range, and there's going to be a vacuum of these companies in the next few years. And this is the opportunity for the smaller companies to move up in the list. So they're going from being 10, 15 to 30, 50, and then they become targets for new roll-ups and new acquisitions. This is a pattern that has happened in the industry for a long, long time. So if you're a smaller company and you're afraid of these trends, don't, because this merger and acquisitions will create a space for you to grow and put your name in that ranking. The third conclusion is that Netflix has created a significant, we use Netflix as a proxy for streaming content, or OTT content, as they call in their own market. And these vendors are exploding in volume. And media localization is such a big trend, not only in the streaming content area, but also in the corporate environment. So you have large companies buying video and subtitling and voiceover services. It's an area, and if you look at our research, the research that we have published so far, you're going to see that there is a lot more research and content related to voice and audio and video, naturally, than other areas, because it's such an area of growth. And I'll do a little plug here for my other project. Globally Speaking Radio is a podcast that we have launched a couple of years ago, and this week's episode is about Netflix in Japan, and it talks essentially about this media challenges and the new challenges that exist for language services. So it's an area of opportunity. It's a challenge, and every challenge is an opportunity. It's an area that you need to be watching, because it's going to affect your business. And that concludes our presentation today. We tried to condense it in a way that you can have the rest of the day for you, but we would be very happy to answer any questions that may come up. Tucker, you are back there in our production facilities. Are there any questions for any of us? Yes, we can hear you.
Renato, will you take it?
Sure. Well, the larger companies are trying to consolidate their base and maintain momentum. As you can see, the top players in the industry, they are owned by investors these days, either private equity or shareholders and so on. So they have to continue in a growth track. So I believe that for the next couple of years, their efforts are going to be in doing more acquisitions and consolidating and integrating the ones that they have already made.
Awesome. And for those of you, the question was, what are these largest LSPs going to do moving into 2018 and beyond to continue growing? And I just have to take a moment to thank Andy here for being my technical support. He left a comment saying we can't hear you. I'm assuming you can hear me now, so I'm going to keep talking. If not, I'm sure Andy will let me know. Next question. There's a lot of this in the Nimdzi 100. There are it lists the largest LSPs in the world, but there's many more smaller LSPs. I'm paraphrasing here. What advice would you have for the small to medium-sized LSPs that want to get onto the top 100 list for next year?
Costa, do you want to take a stab? I can make some comments.
I think it's my turn. Well, you see, being in the right sector, like life sciences, which is exploding, the amount of the clinical research in the United States, for example, in the last 5 years has increased 2.5 times, or video games growing very fast, or media localization. Being in the right sector is important. Concentrating on large corporate clients and large markets is important. We've seen that the long tail companies, they don't have this growth potential, even if they market to 1,000 small clients. One big client is more important than 100, 50, 200 of small ones. And it's also sometimes more interesting to work for a big client with a huge global challenge than going after so many translations of passports or private documents for individuals. So that's it. Sales, large corporate customers, staying interesting for the enterprise, developing new offerings, maybe better service than the larger competitors. Being unique is important, and focus on the fertile ground.
Yes, I would add that, and I would reinforce what you just said, Costa, by saying that 3 comments. Number 1, sales. The only way that you're going to grow is by adding sales. Salespeople, I joke that in many years in this industry, the biggest learning that I've had is that the companies with the biggest sales forces have the highest revenue. So there is a direct correlation between sales and revenue. Quick parenthesis here, we can help you with that. The next comment that I was going to make is that regarding the segments, look at what's going on in the economy as a whole, because the real opportunities are going to be happening in segments that we don't even know exist. And they might not even exist today yet, but they're going to be big tomorrow. I remember when I had my own LSP, 30 years ago, the biggest technology advanced was advanced superconductive ceramics. And all of a sudden, for about 2 years, I had a lot of translation in superconductive ceramics, and which made me grow significantly. It was an area where there was no vocabulary, no terminology, nothing was established. It was a completely new market. So look for those niche markets where you can be the biggest expert in that space. And the other thing, going back to the original question of talking about the smaller LSPs, for this research, we have identified 170 companies around the world that have more than that have around $10 million in revenue or more. And we could only fit the top 100. There is a lot of space for companies to grow to this level. And I suspect that next year, when we come out with our ranking, we're going to have a little we're going to have changes. We already know that the Amesto is a Norwegian company that was already acquired by Semantics. So there's a spot that was open, and these companies that were in the bottom are going to come up. So keep going, keep trying, and keep communicating. We're looking at your growth, and we're here to help.
Okay, I have one more question here for you guys, and you're not going to be surprised. You should know this one was coming. What role is machine learning, artificial intelligence, and automation playing in the language services markets?
I'll take it, okay?
Please.
Renato.
We'll both take it.
I won't let it go with you. Okay. Yeah. Well, one role it's taken is eye candy. Every time you say language AI, you get big customer interested. Even if it's not AI in the background, but something pretty similar, language AI is the catchphrase that makes the people want to go to your presentations and listen to you. The second is, of course, optimization. And large companies will be developing various solutions and are developing various solutions based on machine learning. One of them, for example, is a pricing engine, which would allow an LSP to offer high or lower rates to their suppliers depending on waves in supply and demand. There could be a machine learning component for workflow. Let's say your project is running late, so the robot will decide to skip the review phase because you need to get content translated earlier. So they will cut into the project management jobs from the TMS. So two things: eye candy, conversation opener, and more optimization, squeezing out for more efficiency, improving margins and firing or letting go or transforming project managers into salespeople or engineers that will set up the machine component for a client and then just oversee how it's going on. Renato?
Yes, thanks, Kossi. I agree with everything you said. I would add a couple of things. I don't see this as a threat. I see this as an opportunity. Machine translation is a reality. It already translates in one day more than all the humans translate in 1 year in all languages. It's amazing. Recently Facebook last week released the numbers of translations that they're handling on a daily basis, and it's in the billions of words every day. So it's not new. It's something that has been around over 10 years. And if you are an LSP and you are not using machine translation, if you're talking about confidentiality, if you're talking about risks of machine translation, you're behind the curve. It's a reality. It should be a service that is in your stack, and you need to know how to use it to service your customers. It's an expert tool. The other comment is that it has a role. Artificial intelligence and machine translation and machine learning have a role in our business the same way that it has in every other business. This is the type of technology that is affecting everything from the car you drive, or if you're going to be driving cars, from the way you buy airplane tickets to the way you search for content. You are exposed and you're working with artificial intelligence and machine translation and machine learning every day without knowing. Machine learning has been part of your health diagnostic for at least 20 years. And it's just come up as something new, but it's not necessarily anything new. Again, small plug, listen to Globally Speaking Radio Podcast episode 20 when we talked about that topic. And the final comment that I was going to make is that reinforcing what you just said, I think that for the industry, the most important role of this new approaches to technology is in the process. It's not so much in the language part, it's in the process, project management, vendor management, and sales activities in the company. Tucker and I have written a book called The General Theory of the Translation Company. Strongly recommend you look at it on Amazon. And we talk about that. This is a business where any technology only makes a difference in the areas that create value for the client. And these are project management, vendor management, and sales. This is where you need to think about how it's going to increase your productivity and your profit. The industry is not going away. As I mentioned in the conclusions, it's a growth market. It's going to continue to be a growth market. And the way we interact with this, look at these technologies as multipliers and as an augmentation possibility instead of a threat.
Great. And follow-up question from Facebook from Lori. I think we answered your first question, Lori. The follow-up question would be, do you think Amazon Translate will mirror AI solutions of Google and Microsoft? So do you think Amazon's going to be able to contend with Google and Microsoft in the machine translation and AI space?
Well, I'll take this. Yes.
Quickly.
Very quickly. Yes. They have a very solid team behind it. They have acquired Amazon. Has a lot
Safaba, they acquired Safaba.
They acquired Safaba, an Israeli-based company with a lot of academic background from Carnegie Mellon. And yes, they have. But keep in mind, the beauty of machine translation and artificial intelligence is that all of these technologies have been deployed in open source free access environments. So if you have the right talent, if you know how to use programming, how to use the sandboxes that Amazon, Facebook, Google have put out, and I hear that Apple is coming out with a solution also, you can take advantage of this, benefit from this. Amazon, for example, has a free solution for transcription in 9 languages. You could theoretically read a translation, translate it by voice and have it transcribed using artificial intelligence. And that's a way that you could incorporate it into your process. This is just a crazy idea that I have right now. So making it up as we go. Tucker, I think, how are we on time?
I think I'm going to turn it over to Sandra to close us out. Thank you again, everybody, for your patience. This is our first webinar. We're very excited about this. If you found us on YouTube, congratulations. You're smarter than most because there was some confusion there. So excellent work on that. If you found us on Facebook while you're there, like and subscribe. And Sandra, take it away. Sandra, are you on mute?
We don't hear Sandra. No, she's not on mute.
There you go, technicalities. Sorry. Thank you very much for Tucker, Renato, and Kostya for the presentations and the questions. Guys, thank you to all the over 200 people who joined us today. Our next webinar, Translation Management Systems, a comparison, is on Thursday, the 24th of May, at the same time as today. Tucker and Kostya will take a look at 10 popular translation management systems and compare them step by functionality they offer. So don't miss it. Sign up today. Our very last webinar will be right now inbound marketing for LSPs. That will be on the 14th of July. And we'll take a look at LSP campaigns and processes to develop content and get the most out of it with marketing automation tools. Guys, Nimdzi is a marketing research and consulting company. So if you would like to hear about our services, please don't hesitate to contact us. In the name of Nimdzi and everybody who worked for Nimdzi, thank you, gracias, obrigado, spasiba, everybody. See you on the 24th of May. Thank you very much.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.